Hey guys, so today we're starting on chapter 9, which is Thinking in Language, and this is the first chapter of our third exam. So the first idea here is knowing the difference between a concept and a prototype. So you can think of a concept as simply a category or a group, and your prototype is your best example of that category, your best example of the concept. So if your concept is house pets, for example, your prototype of a house pet would likely be something like a cat or a dog. Those are the most common house pets that we see. Most of your friends probably have a cat or a dog or both, right? You might have a cat or a dog. But what you probably wouldn't say if someone asked you to list a house pet is a lizard or a ferret. Yes, those can be house pets. Some people keep them as house pets, but that's not very common, so you wouldn't consider it to be your prototype. Moving on to an algorithm or a heuristic. And so when it comes to algorithms start at square one and they work all the way to the end or until they find a solution. So an example would be if you're going to the grocery store and you're looking for ketchup, an algorithm to find ketchup would be to start at aisle 1, whatever that is, and go all the way down aisle 1, all the way down aisle 2, down aisle 3, aisle 4, aisle 5, all the way until you find ketchup. That's an algorithm. It's methodical, it's logical, and it guarantees you a solution. So kind of the main key aspects about an algorithm is that it is slow, it's accurate though, and it guarantees a solution. Those are the top 3 things to know and to write down. Algorithms are slow, but they are accurate and they guarantee a solution. Whereas a heuristic is a mental shortcut. And so if I'm going to the grocery store to get ketchup, my heuristic would be, oh, well, ketchup is a sauce, so it's likely in the condiments aisle. I'm going to check there first, right? So the thing about heuristics is they're faster and they're more efficient. However, they're more error prone because essentially what you're doing is check and guess, trial and error, right? If I didn't find the ketchup in the condiments aisle, now where am I going to look? Where any other kind of sauces, where could I think to look next? Or would I have to ask an associate, or would I have to go back to the algorithm and just start at aisle 1 and work my way all the way through the store until I found it, right? So 3 things about heuristics: they're faster, they're more efficient, but they're more error prone. So the trade-off there is, even if it is more efficient, if you make too many errors, all of a sudden it becomes less efficient than having just used an algorithm. Okay. Confirmation bias we talked about back in the prologue, but this is just searching for examples or information that confirms what you think and ignoring stuff that disconfirms what you believe. So a staunch Democrat, for example, is going to watch CNN because it confirms their democratic beliefs, and they're going to switch the channel every single time they see Fox is on, because they don't want information that's contradictory to what they believe. And vice versa, a Republican would want to watch Fox and would want to disregard CNN, right? A fixation is essentially a mental block. That's how I would think of it, a mental block. And so, if you've ever experienced writer's block, that's sort of similar. But a fixation is just, I've tried to solve this problem. I can't figure out how to do it, and I just can't see it from another perspective. I just am not able to figure out the solution to this problem. I'm fixated on my one way of looking at it, and I can't change my perspective. That's fixation. Not being able to change your perspective or change your understanding to solve a problem. And then your mental set is the way that you typically approach a problem, or just kind of your typical strategy for doing something. So, for example, anytime that you solve a puzzle, do you start by putting together the frame first and then working your way in? Or anytime you lose your car keys, do you check the same first 5 places before you look anywhere else? My bathroom counter, my kitchen counter, the table where I eat, my bedside table, right? So your mental set is just based on the experiences you've had in the past, the way that you tend to approach a problem, your strategy for solving things. We talked about perceptual set in chapter 6, and that's just the way that we perceive things, whereas a mental set is how we think and problem solve. Okay, so right here, question B1, is a place where I'm going to have you write something specific down, and I'll be looking for this when I go to, assign you a grade in Canvas. My goodness, I'm getting the most amount of notifications right now, of course. But okay, so for insight and intuition, you should think of insight as that aha moment where all of a sudden you figured it out. You got the riddle, you solved the problem, you figured out what equation to use on your math test, right? Insight is an aha moment. Write that down, an aha moment. An aha moment. I get it. I realize the solution. I understand the solution to this problem. Whereas intuition is your gut feeling. Your gut feeling. Write that down. Gut feeling. So your intuition, maybe when you meet someone for the first time, you get an immediate impression of them, right? You like them or dislike them very strongly from the start. That is your intuition, your gut feeling. You have no good reason to believe that they are or aren't some kind of way because you've just met them. But your gut feeling tells you some information, right? Your intuition comes in. Also note that insight is a conscious process. All of a sudden I've realized a solution, whereas intuition is unconscious. I cannot explain why I feel the way that I do meeting this new person, but I know that that feeling is there and I can recognize it. But it's unconscious. I don't understand why or where or what it came from. So representativeness and availability heuristics are crucial to intro psych. These come up all the time. So for representativeness heuristic, what's happening is you're overestimating how likely something is based on how well it represents or matches what you think it should look like, your prototype. So really, representativeness heuristic has a little bit to do with biases. Whatever biases you come in with will affect how likely you think it is that someone is or is not a certain kind of way. So really the best way to explain this concept is through an example. So if I told you that I have a stack of 100 cards and 80 of them belong to people who worked as janitors and 20 of those cards were descriptions of people who were teachers. And so I'm going to pull one of these 100 cards at random and read you a description. 80 janitor cards, 20 teacher cards. And the card that I pull says that this person loves kids, they enjoy reading, and they work in a university. And I'm going to ask you the question, what is the probability that this card belongs to a teacher? That this description belongs to a teacher? What is the probability? And most people will say, well, gee, they love kids, they enjoy reading, they work in a university. That sounds like a teacher to me. 85% probability that's a teacher. Well, incorrect, because the question was, what is the probability that this is a teacher? And probability doesn't depend on, what someone seems like they should be. Probability depends on only the numbers that you were given, which is what we call base rate information. That's important. Base rate information is what you are ignoring with representativeness heuristic. So, the question, what is the probability that this is a teacher? The correct answer is 20%. The probability is 20% because there are 20 teacher cards and 80 janitor cards. So even though it feels like this should be a teacher, the answer to that question, the probability that it is, has got to be 20%. That's the base rate probability. So that's representativeness heuristic. Another example would be, let's say that someone came up to you and said, the Smiths kid just won the baseball tournament, right? And you immediately think, so the Smiths have, 4 daughters and 1 son, and you immediately assume that the kid who won the baseball tournament is the son. Because to you, your prototype for a baseball player, your best example of a baseball player is probably someone who's male. You assume that if we're talking about a sport, and particularly achieving an award in a sport, that that's probably a male activity, not a female activity. So see how I'm saying biases can come in? But yeah, because you think that the boy represents your best example of a baseball player compared to the 4 girls, that when someone says the Smith's kid, doesn't tell you what gender, the Smith's kid just won the baseball tournament, and you automatically assume it's their son, well, that's not the true probability, right? The probability that it's their son is only 20% because they have 4 daughters, 1 son. The probability that it was one of their daughters is 80%, much higher. But again, we're using our biases to inform our reasoning. Oh, it's probably the boy because boys more frequently play sports well than girls, right? And then availability heuristic really has to do with vivid memories, particularly flashbulb memories. So when it comes to availability heuristic, what you're doing is you're overestimating how risky something is because you have a very particular emotional memory of it happening to someone else or to yourself. So an example would be people think that flying on planes is super dangerous, and that's mostly because they remember something like 9/11, right? Which was hugely traumatic, a big, scary event that involved a plane crash. And so people are scared, and they were scared particularly right after the attack, to fly on airplanes. Makes sense. However, anytime you get in your car, how frequently are you thinking, this is dangerous, I could die? Not very frequently. But car crashes happen way more often than plane crashes. It's just that because you don't have some kind of vivid memory in your mind of a car crash, or maybe you do, maybe you have had a car crash, and these are readily available memories for you. But again, availability heuristic is going to be something that varies person to person. But people assume that risk of flying is higher than risk of driving because they can recall a very traumatic flight crash. However, the true reality of it is that it's way more dangerous to be driving in your car. You're way more likely to die in a car crash than in a plane crash. But people still assume that the risk is higher for flying because it's just so available in their mind. It's so easy to think of a plane crash. Another example would be, let's say that your mom died of the Zika virus, and so you're not scared of dying from something like cancer, which is way more common, but you're terrified of contracting the Zika virus, right? You do everything you possibly can to stay away from mosquitoes so that you couldn't possibly get bit by one and contract the Zika virus. But cancer, of course, is much more common. It's way bigger risk to you to get cancer, but you're not focused on that. You're only focused on the one example because your mom, that was traumatic for you. Your mom died of Zika virus. So that's what you're concerned about. It's available in your mind. It's easy to recall because it's emotionally significant. Okay, we talked about overconfidence in the prologue. Again, this is just being more confident than correct. And particularly as soon as you voice your opinion or you place a bet, you start to become much more confident in the decision that you've made as well. So as soon as you've made a commitment, confidence increases. Belief perseverance is much like confirmation bias. Remember, confirmation bias is seeking out information that confirms what you believe and ignoring information that does not support your beliefs. Well, belief perseverance is continuing to believe in something after you have been proven wrong. So here's what I want you to write down here. This is another one of those kind of buzzwords. Under belief perseverance, I want you to write down evidence. You're given evidence that disproves your belief, and then you continue to believe it anyway. So even in the presence of evidence, you disregard that evidence, that information, and you continue to believe what you believed before. You persevere in that belief. You continue to hold it. Next to framing, I want you to write down wording. Wording. Framing is all about the way you word something, the way that you pose or frame an issue. So, an example of that would be meat that's labeled 25% fat versus 75% lean. We're communicating the same information. If it's 75% lean, that means it has 25% fat. If it's 25% fat, that means it has 75% lean, right? You're communicating the same information. However, when you put those two containers of meat right next to each other, every single person is going to grab the 75% lean one. They're not going to grab the 25% fat one because that sounds worse. 25% fat sounds worse than 75% non-fat or lean, right? So framing is just wording or phrasing. Write that down. Okay. So here are just some examples of framing. If a surgery is framed as having a 10% risk of death versus a 90% chance of survival, people actually think the risk is greater when it's told to them as a 10% risk of death. So if I tell two different people about the same procedure, this procedure has a 10% risk of death, I tell the other person you have a 90% chance of survival, way more people are likely to choose to do the surgery if we say 90% chance of survival compared to 10% risk of death. Becoming an organ donor, so this really has to do with like action versus inaction. But if an organ donation program is an opt-out process, meaning that the default is that you will be an organ donor and you have to choose to leave the organ donor program, then people most likely just go along and choose to be a donor. They don't want to do the action of opting out because people are lazy. That's really what it comes down to. But if it's an opt-in process, the default is that you are not an organ donor, then in fact, people are likely to choose not to be a donor. They aren't going to do any extra action to get into the program. But if they're already in it, they're not going to do any extra action to leave. So whatever the default is what most people will go with. That's what the second example, that's the point that's making. And then kind of the same thing for a retirement plan. If it's an opt-in savings program, they're not gonna likely make an action to opt in, but now it's done automatically and people have to choose to opt out. But again, most people don't choose to opt out. They just go along with whatever the standard is. Okay, and remember how I said that intuition is just that gut feeling that you have about someone or something. And so this is just a little bit of kind of summary about this section, but intuition is something that's unconscious. We talked about that. And a lot of people rely on that. I mean, many professions rely on your ability to use intuition to solve problems quickly and efficiently, right? So nurses, firefighters, mechanics, athletes, they all have to make split decisions all the time, right? So their intuition has got to be active. Intuition is adaptive, right? So intuitively knowing that blurry images are farther away than clear images is helpful for us in figuring out how far away something is, or if we have a predator coming towards us to attack us, right? We can differentiate the predator from the surroundings, things like that. And our intuition constantly affects a ton of aspects of our lives. People believe complex problems require a lot of conscious attention, but actually turns out that you make the best decisions, even on complex problems, after you've been distracted and your unconscious mind has come in, processed the information, and used your intuition to inform your decision. So that's kind of cool. Trust your gut. All right. So now we're moving into sort of this creative thinking section. So when we're talking about convergent versus divergent thinking, for convergent thinking, we're saying, what is just the best solution, one single correct answer to this problem? If we have all of these options of things that we can do, we need to narrow it down so it converges, right, down to one single correct best answer or best plan. Taking all of our options, narrowing them down like a funnel. That's convergent thinking. Whereas divergent thinking is you start with one idea or one set of circumstances and you try to come up with the largest number of solutions you can possibly think of. How many different ways can I diverge my thinking into different directions? How many different solutions can I come up with? How can I think creatively, right? So this is what I want you to write down on your worksheet. Convergent thinking is for academic and logical tasks. Convergent thinking is for academic and for logical tasks. Divergent thinking is for creative tasks. Creative tasks. This is really just a summary, but 5 components of creativity. Expertise, you have to actually know something about what you're doing in order to be creative in it, right? You can't compose a whole symposium, right, if you don't know the first thing about music. You have to have some expertise in order to be creative in the field that you've chosen. Next thing you need is imaginative thinking skills, a venturesome personality. So I think that's kind of interesting. Creativity does correlate with sort of openness to experience and, your sense of adventure. So that's kind of cool. Intrinsic motivation, we have to be motivated from inside ourselves, not by external goods like power or money. And then a creative environment, and that can look different for different people. Whatever environment is most conducive to your creativity may be very different than someone else. One person might need to be in a quiet office to do their best creative thinking, but someone else might need to be outdoors, right? Looking at the scenery, for example. Okay, this is largely summary from your textbook. But I'm just going to kind of run through a few things. The overarching question is, do other species share our cognitive skills? And so we have found some things like black bears and apes can form concepts. Pigeons can sort objects. So they can do certainly some cognitive activities. And then do write down that frontal lobe neurons fire in monkeys when they learn new concepts. That's pretty cool. Frontal lobe neurons fire when they learn new concepts. Chimps and apes can experience and display insight. So that's cool. They have those aha moments where they'll be confronted with some kind of problem. They won't be able to solve it. So they'll just kind of sit down and it looks like they're giving up. And then all of a sudden they jump up out of nowhere and you can just see like the wheels turning in their head, essentially. You can see that aha moment. I figured it out. I have the solution. Under transmitting culture, other species have invented behaviors and transmitted cultural patterns to future offspring. So that's cool. And then do know that animals are frequently engaged in observational learning. Observational learning or cognitive learning, like we talked about in chapter 7, is the most frequent method of learning for animals. And then there's just kind of some cataloging of other skills here at the end, like distinguishing voices, recognizing themselves in a mirror, that's self-awareness, forming coalitions, hunting, tool use, empathy, cooperation, teaching, things like that. So on your worksheet, do not expect you to just copy that down or anything. On your worksheet, you should just have a vague summary, something like this. Bears and apes can form concepts and sort objects. Frontal lobe neurons fire when monkeys learn a concept. Chimps and apes can display insight, right? Things like that. So the 3 types of communication that the definition of language encompasses are spoken, written, and signed words. Spoken, written, and signed words, and how we combine them to communicate meaning. Okay. So now we're going to talk about phonemes and morphemes. So I think of a phoneme like when you're talking on the phone, what are you doing? You are listening for something. We need sound, right? A phone transmits sound. So a phoneme is the smallest sound unit that you have. This could be every single letter in the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Every single one of these is a distinctive sound unit. A is, A, B, B, C, K, stuff like that. But also, sometimes it can be 2 letters or even perhaps 3 letters linked together. Like a TH sound, th, cannot be made with just 1 letter. That requires both T and H. Or at the end of the word nothing, for example, the NG together produces like an ng sound that can't be formed with just an N or just a G or any other letter. So it's the smallest unit that produces a unique sound, is a phoneme. Whereas a morpheme tells you more. Morphemes tell you more information. Morphemes communicate meaning. So any full word on its own is going to be a morpheme. However, it doesn't have to be an entire word. So another example of a morpheme would be like a prefix or a suffix. So adding ed to the word help. help versus helped, those communicate two different meanings. Yes, they're similar, very similar, but they communicate two different meanings. Once I add ed, you know that it's happened in the past, right? Not in the present, not in the future. Adding s onto the end of almost any noun won't pluralize it, right? We'll tell you there's multiple. Cat versus cats. It's more than one. It's a different meaning, right? So phoneme, smallest sound unit, like a phone. What are we getting when we have a phone conversation? We're getting sound information. And a morpheme gives you more. It gives you meaning out of the word, or the part of the word. And then we've got grammar, the system of rules that enables us to have language and communicate. There's two components to that, semantics and syntax. Semantics is how we get meaning from words. So semantics rules explain how the word hit can have multiple different definitions. So in this example, he hit the most difficult note of his hit song, and then he was hit by a flying tomato. The word hit is used 3 times in that sentence, and every single time it has a different meaning. He hit the most difficult note, meaning he reached it, right, of his hit song. And that time hit means popular. And then he was hit by a flying tomato. He was physically, run into, hit by an object, right? And so it's semantics that tells you context, essentially, so that you're able to get that different meaning out of the same word over and over and over again, right? So semantics tells you about meaning and context. Whereas syntax just tells you about the ordering of words in sentences. So, here in the US, we would say White House, right? But someone who's Spanish speaking would say Casablanca, which would translate to house that is white, right? So, in the English language, we tend to put our descriptor first. It's a white house. Whereas in the Spanish language, they put the descriptor after what it is that they're describing, house that is white. So that would be a syntactical or a syntax difference, just the way that we order words in our sentences and the way that we define sort of those grammatical rules for ordering words. Universal grammar is just this idea that we are predisposed to learn grammar rules. And one thing that this explains is why it's so easy to learn multiple languages when you're young. It gets much harder as you get older, right? Because those neural circuits get cut off. But we are predisposed. We are social creatures. We crave learning language and communicating with others. What would you do without words? And so we are built to understand and to learn language. At a very early age. But again, there's a critical period, right, for this. So if we miss that critical period and a child doesn't learn grammar rules, doesn't learn language, we run into an issue where they may never learn it. Okay, so when it comes to receptive versus productive language, receptive language is just that you can understand what is said about you. You can receive language, you can understand or comprehend language. Write that down. Receptive language is understanding or comprehending language. Whereas productive language is all speech, the ability to produce our words. And both of these, receptive and productive language, start at 4 months. So again, receptive is comprehending, understanding. Productive is speaking, producing language. Then we've got the 4 stages of language, or kind of like 3 stages and then a sub-stage. So at 4 months, we have the babbling stage. This is just nonsense syllables. We aren't trying to form any words. We're just making noises, essentially. The child might have a word or two that they can say like mama or dada. But again, this is really just kind of sounds that have come together and sound like words, probably. So that's the babbling stage. 1-word stage happens at about age 1 to 2. And the child is, wow, no way, speaking with 1 word only. So they would point to a toy and they'd yell ball, right? Or block or something like that. TV. Whereas the 2-word stage, which begins at 2 years, we're generally using 2 words to describe things. Green ball, eat pizza, right? Something like that. So just remember that 1-word stage starts at age 1, 2-word stage starts at age 2. So that's kind of a helpful way to remember that. And then within the 2-word stage, we generally reach something called telegraphic speech, which is where a child speaks using a noun and a verb. So within the 2-word stage, you can put any 2 words together, but if it's telegraphic speech, it has to be a noun and a verb that you've put together. You're describing something that is doing something. So cargo, right? Noun and a verb. Cat run. But green ball, that's an adjective and a noun, right? That's just describing what something is, not what something does. If the child said ball bounce, now this is telegraphic speech. But green ball would be just a 2-word stage expression. Okay, this slide is super duper important. So we're going to talk about Broca's and Wernicke's areas. So number 1, an aphasia is just some kind of brain damage that has caused you to struggle with language, whether that's speaking or understanding language. But aphasia is some type of brain damage that affects your ability to use language. So we want to start off with Broca's area, or Broca's aphasia. And so Broca's area is within the frontal lobe, and it directs the muscle movements that are involved in speech. So the actual muscles of my mouth that move to produce the words that I am wanting to say from my mind to my mouth is something that Broca's area, which is in my brain, is responsible for, right? An area of my frontal lobe is responsible for making my mouth move correctly to say the words that I'm wanting to say. Broca's area and Wernicke's area are so important to know what the difference is about. So you want to know that Broca's area has to do with speaking words, actual, production of language. And it's located in the frontal lobe, specifically within the motor cortex of the frontal lobe. Motor cortex of the frontal lobe. People with damage to Broca's area cannot speak words. But what is interesting is they can often sing familiar songs. And that's because the part of your brain that's responsible for singing is in a totally different place than the part of your brain that's responsible for language production. So even though you can't form the correct muscle movements of your mouth to speak words, you can engage those muscles through using the part of your brain that's responsible for singing. So that's kind of cool. But people with damage to Broca's area generally just cannot speak words, but they can comprehend and understand what other people are saying. So if someone asked them a question, they could, in theory, write down an answer and give a response that way, but they're just unable to produce the language to speak it. And then Wernicke's area, on the other hand, is involved in language comprehension. And that's in the temporal lobe within the auditory cortex. This has to do with hearing and understanding words. So if you have damage to Wernicke's area, you cannot understand the words of others. But you do have Broca's area intact, which means that you can control the movements of your mouth. However, because you cannot understand, comprehend language, you cannot process it in your mind, what we get is something called word salad, where people just speak meaningless words. So someone with damage to Wernicke's area does not understand what words mean. They can't comprehend or understand language to really any conceivable degree, but they're still able to form words with their mouth. And so what will often happen is you ask someone with damage to Wernicke's area, hey, how are you doing today? And they're like, TV swing stair pin. And you're like, good, great, thank you for that. Right? It's confusing and we don't know what to do with it. And so when you think about these two issues, Damage to Wernicke's area is really much more severe than damage to Broca's area, because damage to Broca's area does inhibit your ability to speak, but you still understand, comprehend language, and you can give responses in different ways. You can write things down, you can type things, you can get like text-to-voice mechanisms, things like that. So also know, and write this down, that Broca's area is an issue with productive speech, whereas Wernicke's area is an issue with receptive language. Not speech, sorry. Productive language is a Broca's area issue. Receptive language is a Wernicke's area issue. Okay. Do other species have language? Well, you can read through this yourself, but the main takeaway of this section is some animals are in fact capable of communicating through symbols or sign language, but it is only humans that possess language, which we defined as being verbal, written, or signed expressions of complex grammar. We can get somewhere with sign language in apes, but they usually don't get past a second or third grade level in terms of their language comprehension. So it is in fact humans alone that possess the capability to communicate with as complex of a language as we have. Although we can teach animals some aspects of language. And then lastly, we've got linguistic determinism and linguistic relativism. I really just want to focus on what the main point of both of these is, because they really do speak essentially the same thing. But linguistic determinism is too harsh, and linguistic relativism pulls back a little bit. So linguistic determinism is, this man named Worf came up with this hypothesis that language determines the way that we think. And this hypothesis was debunked because it is possible to think of or about things we don't have words for, like a shade of a color that you can't name. But linguistic relativism says, okay, well, maybe language doesn't determine the way that we think, about every single thing. However, certainly our words and our language influence the way that we think. This is just a less extreme, more widely accepted version of linguistic determinism. So I'm going to give you some examples. The ones that are on the slide here. The English language has richer vocabulary for self-focused emotions, while Japanese language has more words for interpersonal emotions. So this is that difference between individualist versus collectivist societies. Many bilingual individuals report they have different senses of self, or that they feel like different people depending on the language that they're using. I have a couple more examples I'll share with you. Countries that have a lot of words to disrespect women have worse attitudes about women, so they actually look at women in different ways, like they have less respect for women, and their language just has more words that they can use to disrespect women with. Bilingual parents will often change their language depending on what emotion or attitude they have towards their child. You might have noticed if you grow up in a bilingual family that your parents tend to yell or discipline in their native language. But I mean, there's just so many different nuances to meaning in language that this makes sense. Language is the absolute basis of our thinking. Can you imagine having a thought that, was completely without words? It's hard. It's possible, of course, to think of things without words, but at the end of the day, you always have a word to name anything that you think about, for the most part. And that's, so it's easy to think about how language could determine the way that we think about and process, the way that we look at things and the way that we feel.